it's me, Galen. Galen's got Parkinson's. I'm going to make a sort of a mini series, and I've called it Heroes of Wargaming, or Heroes of the Hobby. And I want to look at some of the really influential people that helped us get to where we are now. Why? Well, why is because there are a lot of us around now who don't know how we got where we are. And there's a danger as older gamers and people who were around at the beginning move on and leave us to that amazing War Games club in the sky, that knowledge is lost. And I just put my little two penneth in, shove something on YouTube into the internet ether, and hopefully it's a tiny grain of sand for a future questing gamer to find this hint and clue and discover what was. Now, I wasn't at the beginning. I was born during the beginning. So I originally was going to start with the earliest people who made figures, the earliest people who made rules. I worked my way through, but it occurred to me that some sort of prologue might be worthwhile. So I'm not doing that. I'm going to go to 1972 when I joined a War Games club. Now, when I went into that War Games club in 1972, it felt fully formed. It felt like a big traditional thing that had gone on forever. And I feel for two reasons. One, I was very young. And there were people there playing who were in their 60s, 70s. There was a hierarchy. There were mentors. There were people who already had a war game tradition. And they had been at the beginning. And so what was the beginning? Okay, people look at this and go, all right, well, maybe it's H.G. Wells writing his books at the start of the 20th century. Yeah, probably was. But that's not doesn't quite answer the question of how do clubs develop? And it's from clubs that rules develop, and it's from rules that systems like Dungeons and Dragons develop, and it's from historical games and role-playing games that the modern games in boxes and books develop, and whatever comes after that is going to have developed from that. That's the evolutionary process. That's that line of people gradually standing up more straight as they walk along. So, how did that occur? So, all right, so H.G. Wells wrote his book. He wrote two books about war game, playing with toys, really. And they started from a specific place. A friend of his got a really good toy cannon that fired shot. And over coffee, one evening, they got chatting about that. And as chaps do, they started shooting at things. And they had an evening of target practice, which then evolved in their heads to, let's get our old toy soldiers out and we'll start shooting at them, which then led to a set of very basic rules, which, when you read them, have a lot to do with how we wargame. They have ranges, they have rules about moving and shooting, they have cavalry can move further than infantry. That there are rules. No dice, no morale tables, things like that. But it's embryonic. You can see what starts it. By the 1950s, figures to play with games are becoming more sort of realistic. If I look at the figures that were around for my dad, my granddad in the 1920s to the 1940s, they tended to be guardsmen marching on parade, and everybody looked like they were at Troop in the Colour or some solemn celebration. But during the 50s, Britons, for example, started to do soldiers who were in more realistic poses, shooting, advancing with ported arms, things like that. Limited ranges of types of figures, but they were more militaristic. They looked more like they were in an action. So that's one thing. People start to play with those as children, and then as adults continue because of the fun they've had. And the games were originally in the 50s in people's houses. You'd have 2 or 3 friends of a like mind. You'd possibly go to different houses every week. You'd get the kitchen table, you'd set up your game. You would play whatever game you decided to play in whatever way you decided to play it. The 50s, no rules really, no figure manufacturers. But early 60s, things start to change. So 61, 62, we start to get written rules. Donald Featherstone starts to write copious amounts of rules. So rules start to appear in the early 60s, and people notice them. Maybe you spot something in an Airfix magazine, because Airfix comes along. Later on, mid-60s, you get the Airfix explosion with boxes of all sorts of figures. But at the start, it again was limited, but they were there. And the Airfix kits were there, and Airfix made a magazine. So occasionally there'd be something in there. Might be a note in the post office window. Does anybody wargame? And you'd gradually build up your little groups. Which in a way is how I got into wargaming 10 years later. I played with soldiers, as far as my dad was concerned. But he had a friend where he worked who was a wargamer, proper wargamer, at a proper club. And they worked on a row of machines with not much to do except look at the machines, play cards, as far as I can gather. And they got talking, and my dad came home and he said, my pal goes to this war games club in Doncaster, the YMCA. I'm going to take you. And I didn't want to go at first. I thought, a lot of strange men in a club, YMCA. But it then occurred to me that at least I would be guaranteed a war game every week, which I wasn't wargaming on my own, so I went. Me and my brother were the only kids there. My dad didn't go very often. He soon didn't take to it and stop going. But my brother and I carried on going. Me particularly, because I was 4 years older, I went on the bus. And they helped me choose figures, and they gave me advice about painting and the rules. Now, this is later. But in the 60s, so the figures start to come along, rules start to come along. War Games Research Group rules are written in the 60s. So now we've got groups of men, I would say men, groups of people, but predominantly men, playing with their soldiers at home in little teeny-weeny groups, and they start to acquire rules. They see the adverts for rules. If Donald Featherstone's writing a book, he's going to advertise it somewhere. Those rules then feed into what they do, and they start trying different games, different ideas. Some of the earliest Donald Featherstone games I saw were a bit like Sharp, British rifles and French voltigeurs in a town, and the figures were all those Airfix 54mm diorama figures that they based individually, and they had 10 a side max, maybe even 6 a side. So that's where that sort of began to emerge. Later on in the 60s, people start to make metal historical figures. And again, I think we tend to believe that the ones we knew were the first. The first I knew were Hinchcliffe, because that's what the lads at the clubs played with. But the first person making wargaming figures was in America, Jack Scrooby. Now, I didn't know about Jack Scrooby. He was selling from his own shop in America. We weren't buying things from America, it was too expensive. Hinchcliffe came along, and I got into Hinchcliffe. But I lived in Yorkshire, and Hinchcliffe were made largely in Yorkshire. And then that then meant that groups of men who were wargaming began to meet other groups who were wargaming. And the bigger groups couldn't meet in people's houses, they were too big. So maybe collections got too big, groups got too big, spouses, wives, lovers got fed up and everything got really grumpy. And eventually people said, what we need is a proper hall, some venue, scout hut, church hall, community centre, whatever. Let's go there. Doncaster, they booked the room at the YMCA. That way the larger groups come. Now once you've got your venue and you can advertise that, even if it's only in the Doncaster Free Press or somewhere, local rag, other people who are doing this start to come to the satellite of the club, and the club grows. And people bring their own experiences and their own interests. So when I went to the YMCA in 1972, to what felt to me like a well-established, well-oiled, traditional club, it can't have been more than 6 years old. But it felt like it had been there forever. And I think that's because the players that were there were so much older than me. And they had been the first generation that experienced the birth and growth of the hobby. I know that Tony Bath, who again is one of the founder members of this Heroes Club I'm going to start, died in 2008. And I think he was about 80, I think. But when I come to do his programme, I'll do it properly. So if I'd gone to the same club as Tony, or Donald Featherstone, or Bill Lamming, I would have met those people. They were the patriarchs of that society. Then they began to make figures. They began to write rules, they began to make figures. And once somebody writes rules, somebody else writes some different rules. And then there are debates. What anchored us a bit was Wargames Research Group was the standard for competitive gaming. It was the understood norm. So I could go to a Wargames fair. The first one I went to would have been in 74, 73. And I could guarantee that everyone there, from wherever they came, understood Wargames Research Group. Later, 74, 75, I started to buy Bill Lamming miniatures. He did a lot of medieval. And he brought out his own rules, his own campaign rules. But Tony Bath had been bringing out campaign rules before that. And Tony also started to bring in a fantasy element in the UK, because he set his campaign games in the Conan, Robert E. Howard world. So that was another element that was growing. But he also wrote books like How to Set Up a War Game, Basic Strategy. He did a game where it's for scouting, so you just get a piece of board marked out in inches, and you have, I don't know, 6 scouts aside, depends on what you like. Cavalry is really. And you move them, and there are various markers on the board, and when you get to them, you can have a look. And if you can ride back with information, that becomes the starting point for your army. So instead of your armies deploying in 2 straight lines, you suddenly deploy where the scouting has taken you. And successful scouting in one area might give you an advantage. Your scouts might find a bridge over a ford. And it's not the same distance between your army and his. You're there, you're on it. You could set off during the night and get there. Now, that's important. In America, Gary Gygax is playing medieval games, Dark Age games. He writes Chainmail in 1971, which eventually, in the later 70s, becomes Dungeons and Dragons. But in 72, chainmail wasn't in the UK. We were using Wargames Research Group, we were using Bill Lamming, we were using Christie. There were a group, Donald Featherstone. We had our own UK way of doing things. And the American way of doing things was the American way of doing things. And ne'er the twain shall meet. With that, I'm going to say, ta-ra, Chuck.